rain didn't fall, it assaulted the land, a merciless barrage of icy needles driven by a wind that howled like a banshee. It was in this maelstrom that Jedediah found her, a crumpled heap of calico and mud tangled in the lower wire of his own fence line. At first, he'd thought her a fallen calf, another casualty of the unseasonable storm, but as the lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in a stark, momentary photograph, he saw the pale oval of a face and the wild spill of dark hair plastered to the earth. He spurred his horse, Jericho, closer, the animal's unease a palpable thing beneath him. The woman, a girl, really, was barely conscious, her breath a faint ragged cloud in the frigid air. Her dress was torn, her hands raw and bleeding from where she'd clawed at the unforgiving ground. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the grasping mud. As he knelt, the lantern he carried cast a halo of trembling gold around her. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and dark with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from his lungs. They weren't the eyes of someone merely lost in a storm. They were the eyes of a hunted animal run to ground. "Please," she whispered, the word a fragile shard of sound against the gale. "Don't take me back." Jedediah's jaw tightened, the scar that ran from his temple to his chin pulling at the skin. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his heart, a fortress of solitude as impenetrable as the rocky bluffs that guarded his ranch. He didn't want involvement. He didn't want another soul's trouble laid at his door. But the plea in her voice, the sheer animal desperation, bypassed his defenses. He saw the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, a violent purple marring the porcelain of her skin. He saw the faint, chafed red marks on her wrists, as if she'd been bound. He didn't ask who she was running from. The storm in her wounds told him everything he needed to know. With a grunt, he carefully untangled her dress from the barbed wire, his movements gentle despite his calloused, work-hardened hands. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bird with a broken wing. Her head lolled against his chest, a sigh of surrender escaping her lips as consciousness finally fled. He carried her toward the distant, solitary light of his cabin, a lone beacon in an ocean of darkness. The wind tore at them, trying to rip her from his grasp, but he held on, his steps sure and determined. He had no idea who she was or what darkness had sent her fleeing into the heart of a tempest, but as he crossed the threshold into the warmth of his home, he made a silent, unbending vow. No one was taking her back. Not from here. Not while he still drew breath. This ground was his, and what fell upon it he would protect. The storm outside could rage, but inside his walls the hunt was over. He had, without intention or desire, just declared war on a shadow he hadn't yet seen. He laid her gently on the simple cot near the hearth, the firelight playing across her pale features. The girl was young, younger than he'd first thought, perhaps not even 20. Her dark hair, now drying in the warmth, framed a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so etched with hardship. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, his movements methodical and practiced. He'd tended to livestock, to his own injuries, but this felt different. There was a fragility to her that made his large hands feel clumsy and oversized. As he carefully dabbed at the mud on her face, he uncovered more bruises, faint and yellowing ones mingling with the fresh, brutal mark on her cheek. An old anger, a righteous fury he thought he'd buried long ago with his wife and child, began to smolder in the pit of his stomach. Who did this? Who took a creature so slight and treated her with such contemptible violence? He worked in silence, cleaning the cuts on her hands, applying a salve that stung but would keep infection at bay. She whimpered in her fevered sleep, her hands twitching. "No, Silas, please." The name was a ghost in the room, heavy and menacing. Silas. He rolled the name around in his mind. It was a name that carried the weight of power, of land, of entitlement. He'd heard it before, spoken in hushed tones in the town of Redemption miles away. Silas Croft, the baron who owned half the valley and acted as if he owned the people in it too. Jedediah pulled the blanket up to her chin, his expression grim. So this was Croft's property, was it? Fled and broken, washed up on his shore. The world suddenly felt smaller, the isolation he'd so carefully cultivated now a fragile illusion. The storm she'd fled wasn't just the wind and the rain, it was a man. And men like Silas Croft did not take kindly to losing what they considered theirs. Jedediah stoked the fire, the flames leaping high, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He sat in his worn armchair, the rifle he always kept clean now resting across his lap. He wasn't a lawman anymore, not for a long, long time, but some instincts, once learned, never truly died. They just slept, and tonight they had been woken. He would let her sleep, let her heal, and when she woke he would listen. But the decision was already made, forged in the heart of the storm and tempered by the sight of her pain. She had stumbled into the one place in this valley where Silas Croft's power meant less than nothing. She had found the one man who had nothing left to lose and everything to defend. Her flight had ended here, and so too would her fear. He would see to it. He would become the wall she could hide behind, the weapon she could not wield herself. The night wore on, the storm slowly exhausting itself, its fury abating to a mournful sigh. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the young woman's shallow breathing. Jedediah did not sleep. He watched over her, a silent, unmoving guardian. The memories he fought so hard to keep at bay during the daylight hours came flooding back in the quiet dark. He saw his wife, Sarah, her smile as bright as a sunrise. He saw his son, little Thomas, his laughter echoing in the hollow chambers of his heart. They were ghosts, taken from him by a sickness that swept through their old homestead, a tragedy that had shattered his world and sent him seeking this solitude. He had failed to protect them from the randomness of fate, and the guilt had been his constant companion ever since. He looked at the girl on the cot. He saw not a stranger, but a chance to stand against a different kind of sickness, a human one, born of cruelty and greed. It was a fool's errand, perhaps. A man like Croft had resources, men, influence. Jedediah had a small ranch, a steady hand, and a core of iron will that had been tested in fire. It would have to be enough. When dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, the girl began to stir. Her fever had lessened, but the terror returned the moment her eyes opened. They darted around the unfamiliar cabin, landing on him in his chair, the rifle still across his lap. Fear, stark and immediate, seized her. She tried to scramble back, a choked cry catching in her throat. "Easy," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble, careful not to make any sudden moves. "You're safe here." He placed the rifle carefully against the wall, a deliberate gesture of peace. "The storm, it brought you to my fence line last night. You're on the stone ranch." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Where? Who are you?" "Jedediah Stone." He rose slowly and walked to the hearth, pouring a cup of water from the kettle. "And you?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door as if gauging her chances of escape. She was a cornered doe, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. "Elara," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "Just Elara." He brought the cup to her, and she flinched as he drew near, but the thirst was too great. She took it with trembling hands, drinking greedily. "You're safe, Elara," he repeated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He hadn't spoken a woman's name in this cabin in 5 years. "No one will harm you here." Her eyes, filled with a pain that went far beyond her physical injuries, searched his. She was looking for the lie, the trap she had clearly learned not to trust kindness. "He'll come looking," she said, her voice barely audible. "Silas. He always finds what's his." The possessive term sent another jolt of cold anger through him. "You're not a stray cow, girl. You're not his." Her laugh was a brittle, broken sound. "That's not what the law says, not what the marriage certificate says." Marriage. So that was it. Not just a servant. A wife. Sold and shackled. The ugliness of it settled in the room, thicker than smoke. Jedediah's face was a granite mask, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "We'll see what I say," he said, the words a low, definitive promise. "Here, on this land, my word is the only law that mattered." The days that followed were a quiet, delicate dance of trust. Elara remained wary, a ghost haunting the corners of his small cabin. She moved silently, flinching at loud noises, her eyes constantly straying to the window, to the long, empty road that led away from the ranch. Jedediah gave her space. He went about his chores, mending what the storm had broken, tending to a small herd of cattle. He left food for her on the table, fresh clothes, one of Sarah's old, simple dresses that he'd kept packed away in a cedar chest, and a basin of water for washing. He spoke little, sensing that words were a currency she had learned to distrust. Instead, he communicated through actions. He ensured the fire never went out. He made sure the cabin was always warm. He never entered without knocking softly first. Slowly, cautiously, she began to emerge from her shell. One morning, he returned from the barn to find she had washed their plates. The next afternoon, she had mended a tear in his shirt with small, neat stitches. They were tiny gestures, offerings of peace, and he accepted them in the same spirit, with a silent nod of acknowledgement. He started to see the person beneath the fear. He saw the intelligence in her eyes as she watched him work, the way her hands, though unused to labor, were quick and deft. He saw a flicker of a smile when one of his dogs, a scruffy mutt named Buck, laid his head in her lap. The first time she spoke without being spoken to, it was to ask about the brand on the back of his hand. A cruel, star-shaped scar. He had been cleaning his saddle, his back to her. He paused, his hands stilling. The silence stretched. "A reminder," he said finally, not turning around, "that justice and law ain't always the same thing." He offered no more and she did not ask, but in that moment a new understanding passed between them. They were both marked by the past, branded by injustice. His scar was on his skin, hers were on her soul, but they were kin all the same. That evening, as a fragile peace settled over the valley, she finally told him her story. She spoke in a low, halting monotone, as if recounting a tale that had happened to someone else. She was an orphan, raised in a grim institution until she was old enough to be sold. Silas Croft, a man 3 times her age, had wanted a young wife to give him an heir, a piece of property to complete his collection. Her life with him had been a nightmare of isolation and cruelty, of silent meals in a cavernous dining hall and nights filled with a terror she could only allude to. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back after he'd struck her for dropping a plate. The final humiliation in a long line of them. When she finished, the fire had burned down to embers and the cabin was filled with a profound, aching silence. Jedediah hadn't moved, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He offered something more solid. "He will not lay a hand on you again," he said, his voice raw with a conviction that was absolute. "I swear it on the memory of my family. This is your sanctuary now." Ilara looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the fear in her eyes was replaced by a fragile, tentative flicker of hope. She had run from a monster and stumbled into the care of a man who was, in his own way, just as formidable. As the first week bled into the second, a fragile routine began to form, a quiet rhythm of domesticity that was new to them both. Jedediah found himself looking forward to returning to the cabin, to the smell of stew simmering on the stove, or the sight of Ilara sitting by the fire, a mending basket in her lap. Her presence filled the hollow spaces of his home, of his life, in a way he hadn't realized was possible. He began to teach her things, small skills that gave her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He showed her how to properly bank the fire so it would last through the night, how to milk their one gentle cow, Bessie. He took her to the small vegetable patch behind the cabin and showed her how to weed, how to recognize the plants that nourished from those that poisoned. Her hands, once soft and pale, became smudged with dirt and pricked by thorns, but her eyes gained a new light. She was learning to cultivate, to nurture, to create life in a small patch of earth that was, for now, hers to tend. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, speaking softly to Jericho, his usually cantankerous horse. The animal stood perfectly still, its head lowered as she stroked its powerful neck. Jedediah watched from the doorway, unseen. He had never seen the horse so calm with anyone but himself. "He's a good boy, isn't he?" she murmured to the animal. "Just lonely, like your master." She turned then, startled to find Jedediah there. A blush crept up her neck. "I'm sorry, He likes you," Jedediah said, cutting off her apology. He walked over, running a hand along the horse's flank. "He doesn't like most people." He looked at her, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "Maybe he knows you're one of the good ones." The compliment, simple and unadorned, hung in the air between them. It was more than anyone had ever given her. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of hay and horse, Ilara felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling so alien it was almost frightening. She was no longer just a refugee. She was becoming a part of this place. But their peaceful interlude was a fragile bubble destined to burst. The outside world intruded one crisp morning in the form of a lone rider, silhouetted against the rising sun. Jedediah saw him from the porch, a dark figure moving steadily up the long track to the ranch. Lara, who was scattering feed for the chickens, froze, her face draining of all color. "Go inside," Jedediah said, his voice low and calm but with an underlying edge of steel. "Lock the door, stay away from the windows." She didn't argue, scurrying inside the cabin like a frightened mouse. Jedediah remained on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent, immovable object waiting for the approaching trouble. The rider was one of Croft's men, a hired gun named Fletcher with a mean streak and shifty eyes. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch, his gaze sweeping over the small, well-kept ranch. "Stone?" Fletcher grunted, a token nod of greeting. "Heard you weathered the storm." "I did," Jedediah replied, his voice flat. "What do you want, Fletcher?" Fletcher's gaze lingered on the cabin door, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Mr. Croft is missing something. A piece of property. Small thing. Answers to the name of Alara. You wouldn't have seen her, would you? She ran off in the storm a couple of weeks back." The casual, dehumanizing way he spoke of her made Jedediah's blood run cold. He kept his expression unreadable, a mask of indifference. "Can't say that I have. Lots of things get lost in a storm. Coyotes have been eating well." Fletcher's smirk widened. "Funny, we tracked her this far. The trail went cold right around your property line. Was that a fact?" Jedediah said, uncrossing his arms and letting his hand rest casually on his hip, inches from the Colt holstered there. "Maybe your tracker's no good?" The air crackled with unspoken threats. Fletcher was testing him, probing his defenses. Jedediah met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Croft is offering a reward," Fletcher said, changing tactics. $100, just for information on her whereabouts. He's a forgiving man. He just wants his wife back home where she belongs. $100? Jedediah repeated, his voice laced with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical blow. "You tell Silas Croft that my land and everything on it is not for sale. Not for $100, not for 1,000. Now get off my property." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. He was a bully, used to people cowering before the name of his employer. Jedediah's quiet defiance unsettled him. He held Jedediah's gaze for a long moment, then gave a short, sharp nod. "I'll deliver your message, Stone." He wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Jedediah watched him go, his jaw tight. This was the first move in a game he knew was far from over. The warning shot had been fired. He turned and went back inside. Alara was standing in the middle of the room, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows I'm here." "Yes," Jedediah said, his voice grim. He walked to the gun rack, taking down his repeating rifle. He began to check the action, his movements efficient and deliberate. "And now he knows he's not getting you back without a fight." The encounter with Fletcher shattered the illusion of safety they had built. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It had a face and a name, and it was closing in. The quiet peace of the ranch was replaced by a taut, watchful tension. Jedediah became a sentinel, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He spent the daylight hours reinforcing the ranch, checking the sight lines from the cabin, ensuring every door and window was secure. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a soldier, preparing for a siege. Alara, in turn, was consumed by a renewed and sharpened fear. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a hawk sent her heart racing. She saw Croft's face in the shadows, heard his voice on the wind. The terror was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. One evening she broke down, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "You should let me go," she sobbed, her face buried in her hands. "He'll destroy you, all for me. I'm not worth it. I'm worth nothing." Jedediah knelt in front of her, his large hands hovering uncertainly before he gently took her wrists, pulling her hands away from her face. He forced her to look at him, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "You are not nothing. His cruelty doesn't define your worth. Do you understand me?" He held her gaze until she gave a small, shaky nod. "I made a promise," he continued, his grip firm but not painful. "To you and to myself. I don't break my promises. We will face this together. He has not taken you from this place." His certainty was an anchor in her sea of fear. It didn't banish the terror, but it gave her something solid to hold on to. She saw in his scarred face not pity, but a fierce, protective resolve that was as wild and unyielding as the land itself. She realized then that he wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting for something he had lost long ago. He was fighting for the very idea that one person could stand for another, that justice was a thing to be forged with will and iron, not just decreed by wealthy men. Her fight had become his. The next day, Jedediah made a decision. If they were to be partners in this fight, she could not be a helpless bystander. He took her out to a clearing behind the barn, a small pistol in his hand. A lighter model, one of Sarah's. "You need to know how to defend yourself," he said simply. Elara stared at the weapon as if it were a snake. I've never held a gun before. There's a first time for everything," he said. He showed her how to hold it, how to stand, how to aim. His hands guided hers, his instructions patient and clear. He was a natural teacher, his voice calm and steady. The first time she pulled the trigger, the recoil knocked her back a step, and the shot went wide, kicking up dirt far from the tin can he had set on a stump. She was startled, ready to give up. "Again," he said, his voice firm. "Don't close your eyes. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." Over and over they practiced. The loud report of the gun echoed through the valley, a declaration of defiance. Slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a focused concentration. Her shots grew steadier, closer to the mark. Finally, a clean shot sent the can flying. A small triumphant smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. In that moment, he saw the woman she could be, free from fear. He wasn't just teaching her to shoot. He was giving her back a piece of her own power. He was turning the hunted into a huntress. Valley, however, was not a vacuum. News of Jedediah's defiance traveled fast. Silas Croft was a man accustomed to absolute obedience. To be thwarted by a reclusive, half-broken rancher was an insult he could not abide. He wasn't just a cruel man, he was a vain one. This was no longer about retrieving a runaway wife. It was about crushing a rebellion, about making an example of Jedediah Stone. Croft escalated his campaign. He couldn't launch an open assault, not without inviting scrutiny from the territorial marshal, but he could wage a war of attrition. One morning, Jedediah woke to find the wire on his northern fence line cut in a dozen places, his cattle scattered across the open range. It took him 2 full days of hard riding to round them up, time spent away from the cabin, leaving Elara alone with her fear and the pistol he'd taught her to use. Another time, his well was fouled, the water suddenly brackish and undrinkable. He was forced to haul water from the creek, a back-making, time-consuming task. These were messages, signed by Croft's malice. They were designed to wear him down, to exhaust his resources and his spirit. Elara watched the toll it was taking on him. He grew leaner, harder. New lines of exhaustion were etched around his eyes, but his resolve never wavered. If anything, Croft's cowardly attacks only hardened it. Elara refused to be a liability. She worked tirelessly, taking over the domestic chores, tending the garden, managing their dwindling supplies with a careful hand. She was no longer just his ward, she was his partner. The cabin became their fortress, their world. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of their days, but it was now mingled with a fierce, shared determination. They were 2 solitary souls drawn together by circumstance, now bound by a common enemy. In the quiet evenings, after the work was done and the doors were barred, they would talk. He spoke of the wife and son he had lost, not with the raw grief of before, but with a quiet, sad acceptance. She spoke of her dreams for a life she never thought she'd have, a small home, a garden, the freedom to walk in the sun without looking over her shoulder. In sharing their wounds, they began to heal. A deep, unspoken affection grew between them, born not of passion but of mutual respect and a profound understanding of each other's scars. They were 2 halves of a whole, finding in each other the strength they lacked alone. They both knew this quiet stalemate could not last. Croft was a patient predator, but his patience would have its limits. The final confrontation was coming. It was as certain as the setting sun. The breaking point arrived on a hot, breathless afternoon. A rider approached, not one of Croft's thuggish hands, but the town sheriff, a man named Biddle, whose loyalty to Silas Croft was an open secret. Sheriff Biddle was a portly man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow and an air of self-importance that barely masked his cowardice. He rode with 2 deputies, their hands resting on their pistols, their expressions grim. Jedediah met them on the porch as before, but this time Alara stood in the open doorway behind him, the small pistol held loosely at her side. Her fear was a cold stone in her belly, but she would not hide. She would not be a ghost in her own life any longer. "Stone," Biddle said, his voice attempting a tone of official authority. "I have a warrant here, a complaint filed by Mr. Silas Croft concerning the abduction of his wife, Alara Croft." He held up a piece of paper as if it were a holy relic. "Abduction?" Jedediah's laugh was a harsh, humorless bark. "She came here of her own free will, Biddle. Fleeing a monster, you know what he is." Biddle's eyes flickered nervously. "That's not my concern. The law is the law. I'm here to return Mrs. Croft to her legal husband." "She's not going anywhere," Jedediah stated, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I'm warning you, Sheriff, turn around and ride away." "Now you listen to me, Stone," Biddle blustered, his courage bolstered by his deputies. "You're obstructing justice. I can arrest you for this." "You can try," Jedediah said. The standoff was absolute. The sun beat down on the 4 men, the only sound the buzzing of flies and the frantic beating of Alara's heart. From behind Jedediah, Alara's voice rang out, clear and steady, surprising them all, most of all herself. "I am not his property, Sheriff. I am a human being. He beat me. He locked me away. If you take me back, you are sentencing me to death." She stepped forward, standing beside Jedediah, raising the pistol and pointing it, not at Biddle, but at the sky. "I will not go back. I would rather die here, a free woman, than live another day as his slave." The raw conviction in her voice, the desperate courage of her stand, gave Biddle pause. This was not the simple matter he had been led to believe. This was messy, complicated. It had the stink of real trouble. Before Biddle could respond, another figure appeared, riding up the track behind the sheriff's posse. It was Silas Croft himself. He rode a magnificent black stallion, his clothes expensive, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was a handsome man in a severe predatory way, but his eyes were as cold and dead as river stones. He ignored Jedediah completely, his gaze locking onto Alara. "Alara," he said, his voice deceptively soft, yet carrying an unmistakable menace. "You have caused enough trouble. Put that toy down and come home. We can forget this foolishness." The sound of his voice sent a tremor of pure terror through her, but she held her ground, her knuckles white on the grip of the pistol. "No," she said, the words small but defiant. "I'm not your plaything anymore, Silas." Croft's face tightened, the mask of civility slipping. "Sheriff," he snapped, his voice like a whip crack, "do your duty. Arrest this man and bring me my wife." Biddle, caught between Croft's command and Jedediah's iron will, began to sweat profusely. "Now, Mr. Croft, let's not be hasty," but Croft had lost his patience. "Do it, or I will have your badge." He spurred his horse forward, intending to ride past the sheriff and take her himself. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Croft's horse drew level with the porch, Jedediah moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He didn't draw his gun. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing the reins of Croft's stallion, yanking the animal's head down. The powerful horse reared in surprise and anger, and Silas Croft, for all his arrogance, was unseated, tumbling to the dusty ground in an undignified heap. The 2 deputies, startled, finally drew their weapons. "Don't!" Jedediah snarled, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand, aimed squarely at Biddle's chest. "Tell them to stand down, Sheriff. Now." Biddle, staring down the barrel of Jedediah's gun, swallowed hard. "Hold your fire, boys! Hold your fire!" Croft scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. His fine suit was covered in dust, his dignity shattered. "You'll hang for this, Stone!" he shrieked. "I own this valley. I own the judge. I own everything." "You don't own me," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady. "And you don't own her." He gestured with his gun toward the road. "Get off my land, all of you." Croft stared at him, his chest heaving. He looked at Alara, who stood tall, her fear now burned away by defiance. He looked at the useless sheriff and his trembling deputies. For the first time in a long time, Silas Croft had been faced with something his money could not buy and his power could not break. With a final, Venomous glare, he turned, snatched the reins of his horse and mounted. "This isn't over, Stone," he spat. He rode away without a backward glance, his men and the humiliated sheriff trailing in his wake. As they disappeared over the rise, the tension finally broke. Ilara's legs gave out and she sank to her knees, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers. Jedediah was instantly by her side, his hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's over. For now," she whispered, looking up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and gratitude. "He won't stop. You know he won't." "I know," Jedediah agreed, his gaze fixed on the empty road. "He'll be back, and he won't bring the law with him next time." The confrontation left an uneasy quiet in its wake. They had won the battle, but both knew the war was far from over. Croft's public humiliation would demand a violent retribution. The next attack would not be stealthy or subtle. It would be a blunt, brutal assertion of his power. The waiting was the hardest part. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. They lived on a knife's edge, the silence of the ranch more menacing than any noise. Jedediah and Ilara moved in a quiet, synchronized orbit, their bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. They rarely spoke of what was coming, but it was always there, an unspoken understanding that passed between them in a shared glance or a steadying touch. One night as they sat by the fire, Ilara looked at the star-shaped brand on his hand. "You never told me how you got that," she said softly. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I was a deputy back in Texas," he began, his voice a low murmur. "There was a land baron there, a man like Croft. Name was McCleary. He wanted a family's ranch, one that bordered his. When they wouldn't sell, he had 'em killed. Burned their house down with them inside. He paid a witness to say I did it. Said I was in league with them, that we had a falling out." He touched the scar. "McCleary was the justice of the peace. He branded me himself. A traitor's star, he called it. I was set to hang." He paused, the memory a heavy weight. "My wife, Sarah, she found proof. A letter from the man McCleary paid. She cleared my name, but it was too late. The sickness had already come through our town while I was in that cell. By the time I was free, she and my boy were gone." The confession hung in the air, a story of profound injustice and loss. Ilara felt a wave of empathy so strong it was a physical pain. She finally understood the depths of his solitude, the source of his fierce, protective rage. He wasn't just fighting Croft, he was fighting the ghost of McCleary. He was rewriting the ending to his own tragic story. She reached out and placed her small hand over his, covering the scar. "You're a good man, Jedediah Stone," she whispered. "Sarah knew it, and I know it." He looked at their hands, her pale, slender fingers covering his scarred, calloused ones. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he thought long dead. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, a profound and silent communion of two broken souls who had found in each other a reason to be whole again. The attack came, as they knew it would, in the dead of night, under the sliver of a new moon. Jedediah was a light sleeper, and the faint, unnatural crunch of gravel on the road was enough to bring him wide awake. He was out of bed in an instant, rifle in hand, his movements silent and fluid in the darkness. He touched Ilara's shoulder. "They're here," he whispered. Her eyes flew open, fear instantly coiling in her gut. But she didn't panic. She nodded, her training taking over. She grabbed the pistol from the bedside table and moved to her position by the side window, just as they had practiced. Through a crack in the shutters, Jedediah could see them. At least half a dozen dark figures on horseback, spreading out to surround the cabin. They weren't Croft's usual ranch hands, these were hired guns professionals. Croft had spared no expense. A voice called out, dripping with menace. It was Fletcher, the man who had come before. "Stone! Croft wants the girl. Send her out, and he might let you live. He's feeling generous tonight." Jedediah didn't answer. Words were useless now. The first shot came from the darkness, splintering the wood of the doorframe. The siege had begun. The next hour was a terrifying symphony of chaos. Gunshots shattered the night, the flash of muzzles illuminating the grim, determined faces of the attackers. Glass exploded as a window was shot out. Ilara, her heart pounding against her ribs, fired back, the small pistol bucking in her hands. She wasn't aiming to kill, but to keep them from getting too close to the windows to make them keep their heads down. Jedediah was a force of nature. He moved from window to door, a phantom in the firelight, his rifle barking with deadly precision. He was no longer just a rancher. The instincts of the lawman, the survivor, had taken over completely. He was calm, focused, his every movement economical and purposeful. He fought with a cold, contained fury, protecting not just a woman but the very last bastion of his own soul. One of the attackers made a rush for the door, a heavy axe in his hands. Jedediah's rifle cracked once and the man fell, the axe clattering on the porch. Another tried to climb through the broken window, and Alara, seeing him, fired without hesitation. The man cried out and fell back into the darkness. She was terrified, but she was fighting. She was no longer a victim. In the lull between volleys, a new sound reached them, the ominous crackle of flames. They had set the barn on fire. The orange glow lit up the night sky, a funeral pyre for the life Jedediah had built here. He saw it through the window, his face a mask of stone. He had lost a barn, a horse, a cow, but he would not lose this fight. The fire was a desperate final gambit. Croft's men knew they couldn't stay long. A blaze like that would be seen for miles. It was a ticking clock. They grew bolder, more reckless, trying to end the fight before help could be summoned. A bullet tore through the wall near Jedediah's head, showering him with splinters. He didn't flinch. He aimed and fired, and another shadow fell. He was a cornered grizzly, more dangerous with every wound. Just as it seemed their ammunition, and their hope, was beginning to run low, another sound cut through the night. The thunder of approaching horses. Not just a few, but many. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought Croft had brought more men, but then a voice roared out, a name Jedediah hadn't heard in years. Jed Stone! Hold on! We're coming! Fletcher and his men, hearing the approaching cavalry, panicked. This wasn't part of the plan. They had been paid to bully a lone man, not fight a small army. They scrambled for their horses, firing a few last wild shots before melting back into the darkness from which they came. The cabin fell silent, the only sound now the roar of the burning barn and the pounding of their own hearts. A dozen riders galloped into the yard, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. At their head was a grizzled old rancher named Pembroke, a man from the next valley over, known for his stubborn independence and his deep-seated hatred of bullies like Croft. "Jedediah, you old goat," Pembroke bellowed, swinging down from his horse. "Heard you were having a party and didn't invite us." Jedediah opened the cabin door, his rifle still smoking. Alara stood behind him, pale but steady. "Took you long enough, Henry," Jedediah said, a weary but genuine smile touching his lips. "Had to get the boys together," Pembroke said, his eyes taking in the bullet-riddled cabin and the blazing barn. "Saw the fire from my ridge. Figured it was Croft's brand of negotiating." The other ranchers, men who had been cowed by Croft for years, now stood in Jedediah's yard, their rifles held ready. Jedediah's stand had been the spark. His defiance had given them the courage to find their own. They were no longer scattered and afraid. They were a community, united against a common tyrant. The fight at the cabin was over, but the war for the valley had just begun. The burning of Jedediah's barn and the open assault on his ranch could not be ignored. It was an act of war not just against one man, but against all the small ranchers Croft sought to dominate. Pembroke and the others stayed through the night, helping to put out the fire and standing guard. In the gray light of dawn, standing amidst the smoldering ruins of his barn, Jedediah knew what he had to do. He could not wait for Croft to strike again. He had to take the fight to him. "He tried to use the law against me," Jedediah said to Pembroke, his voice hard as iron. "Now I'm going to use it against him." He looked at Alara, who was tending to a shallow graze on his arm. Her touch was gentle, her eyes filled with a fierce pride. "Silas thinks his money makes him the law," she said. "He's about to find out what real justice looks like." Jedediah, accompanied by Pembroke and a half-dozen other grim-faced ranchers, rode for the town of Redemption. They didn't ride as a posse or a lynch mob. They rode as citizens demanding justice. Alara insisted on coming. "I started this," she said, her chin held high. "I will see it to the end. I am his chief accuser." When they arrived in town, they found Silas Croft in the saloon, drinking with a furious Sheriff Biddle. Croft's arrogance was so complete he believed his failed attack would have no consequences. He thought the ranchers would scatter back to their homes, thoroughly intimidated. He was wrong. Jedediah walked into the saloon, the other ranchers filling the doorway behind him, blocking out the light. The room fell silent. Croft looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and rage. "Stone, I see you brought your peasant army. What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with authority, "is that your reign is over, Croft." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. The letter Sarah had found years ago. The one that proved the land baron McCleary had framed him. He had kept it all these years as a bitter reminder. Now it was a weapon. "I know your kind," Jedediah said, his eyes boring into Croft. "You think you can buy and burn your way to power. You framed me for murder once, a man just like you, but you get sloppy, you get arrogant." He then turned to the silent, watching crowd in the saloon. "He sent hired guns to my ranch last night. They tried to kill me, to kidnap this woman. They burned my barn to the ground." He pointed a finger at Sheriff Biddle. "And this so-called lawman did nothing, because he's a coward, bought and paid for by this man." A murmur went through the crowd. Many of them had their own grievances with Croft, small injustices they had been too afraid to voice. "Is a liar," Croft sputtered, getting to his feet. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Elara stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. She was no longer the frightened, battered girl who had collapsed at Jedediah's fence. She stood tall, her voice clear and strong. "I am the proof. Look at me." She pointed to the fading bruise on her cheek. "This is his mark. He bought me like cattle, and he treated me worse. He is a monster who hides behind his money. Are you also afraid of his gold, that you will let him burn down your homes and attack your neighbors? Is that the town you want to live in?" Her words, simple and true, were more powerful than any legal document. She was the conscience of the valley awakened. The men in the saloon looked at each other, then at Croft, their expressions hardening. They saw not a powerful baron, but a common bully. Pembroke stepped forward. "We've already sent a rider for the territorial marshal. He'll be interested to hear about last night, and about a sheriff who aids and abets attempted murder." Sheriff Biddle went pale. His loyalty to Croft evaporated in the face of federal law. Croft was cornered. His power, which had always seemed so absolute, was an illusion, built on the fear of others. And now, they were no longer afraid. In a desperate, final act, he drew a small derringer from his coat pocket, aiming it at Elara. "She is mine," he screamed. "If I can't have her, no one will." But Jedediah had been waiting for it. He moved in a blur, striking Croft's arm, sending the small gun flying across the room. He slammed Croft back against the bar, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "It's over, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice a low, final judge. The fight went out of Croft. His face crumpled, and for the first time he looked what he truly was, a small, pathetic man, stripped of his power. The ranchers surged forward, surrounding him, their faces a wall of cold condemnation. The final act was quiet and swift. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, a stern, incorruptible man who listened patiently to the litany of crimes laid at Croft's door. He heard from Elara, from Jedediah, from Pembroke, and a dozen other ranchers who had finally found their voices. He saw the burned-out barn and the bullet holes in the cabin. The evidence was overwhelming. Silas Croft was arrested, his land and assets frozen pending a trial he was certain to lose. Sheriff Biddle was stripped of his badge and faced charges of his own. A new era had begun in the valley, one not ruled by fear, but by the collective will of its people. Weeks later, the autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the stone ranch. A new barn was being raised, a collaborative effort by the ranchers of the valley, their hammers echoing in the crisp air in a rhythm of community and renewal. Jedediah stood on the porch, watching them work. He was no longer a recluse. He was a leader, a man respected not for his isolation but for his integrity. Elara came to stand beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. She had put on weight and the color had returned to her cheeks. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a calm, steady light. She was home. "It's beautiful," she said, looking at the rising frame of the barn. "Yes, it is," he replied. But he wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at her. The scars they both carried were still there. His was on his hand, a reminder of a past injustice. Hers were deeper, invisible, but healing every day in the safety and warmth of his love. They hadn't spoken the words, but they didn't need to. Their love had been forged in fire and fear, tested in battle, and now settled into a quiet, unshakable certainty. "My past," Jedediah said softly, "it made me build walls. I thought they were to keep the world out, but I think they were just waiting for you to tear them down." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "And my past taught me how to run. I think I was just running toward you all along." They stood together, watching the sunset. Two solitary souls who had found in each other a sanctuary, a partnership, and a love as strong and enduring as the land itself. Their fight was over, and in the quiet peace of the valley, their life was just beginning. If you found a piece of your own hope in Jedediah and Elara's story of redemption, please show your support by liking this video. Subscribe to the channel for more tales where courage overcomes cruelty and love heals the deepest wounds. Let us know in the comments what part of their journey moved you the most.